It's entirely possible for us to claim to follow Jesus without ever being deeply formed by Christ. Our pace can be too fast to be in true union with God, and we don't know how to quiet our hearts and minds to be present. Our emotions can be unhealthy and compartmentalized. We can feel unable to love well or to live a better way, differently from the rest of the world, to live as people of the good news. The deeply formed life centers on 5 key values: contemplative rhythms, racial reconciliation, interior examination, sexual wholeness, and missional presence that will help us be deeply formed by Jesus to restore balance, focus, and meaning for our souls.
Mikkel, have you ever seen the movie Titanic?
Yes, yes I have.
You have?
Yeah.
So I have a kind of a guilty confession to make, and that's I have a soft spot for this movie Titanic. It came out when Jan and I were first dating, and we watched it a whole bunch of times. And I know that the movie won lots of awards, but I'm kind of embarrassed by how many times I've seen it and how much I enjoyed it. How about you?
So, it came out when I was 12.
Okay.
But I watched it like 4 times in the theater. Like I remember going back over
4 times
4
in the
times.
theater.
Yes. And then I also remember going to sleepovers with my friends, and like it was so long, there was a 2-pack for the VHS.
Whoa.
Like, and
yeah,
so we had to, you know, switch it out in between.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I mentioned the Titanic in this movie because Rich Villodas uses that in the introduction to his book, The Deeply Formed Life. We're starting a new series today that's based on that book. And in talking about the Titanic, he mentions that there's this stark contrast between the decks of the Titanic. So you have these upper decks where all of the rich people, all the rich passengers are traveling, and it's just amazing. It's gorgeous, it's opulent. And then you have the lower decks of the Titanic where the more common person, probably the poorer person, is and it's just much more utilitarian. I mean, maybe still nice because the Titanic was new, but there's this huge contrast between the upper and the lower decks. Now, the Titanic, of course, is well known for its maiden voyage. Spoiler alert, they hit an iceberg, the ship sinks, and eventually it didn't matter which deck you were on, the upper or lower deck, everyone was impacted by the flood of water that came in and the boat sinking.
Yeah. But what's kind of interesting about this contrast is that when the iceberg hit, the people on the upper decks didn't know. Like their life kind of just continued as normal. Everything seemed great. But the people on the lower decks were impacted by this immediately.
And the metaphor of the Titanic sets up this series, in that the upper decks of our lives, the places that other people see, everything might look good on the surface, but underneath on those lower decks, it can be a totally different story. There are many of places in our lives, you know, whether it's our family or our work or our emotional lives, where we're in danger of getting sucked under. Like there's stuff there under the surface that is not good in our lives.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are really good at like arranging the chairs on the upper decks of the Titanic, like making everything look good. We use social media to present this sort of carefully curated version of ourselves. Yeah. And it's like the upper deck of the Titanic where like everything seems really good, but underneath there's a lot more going on there that maybe we're ignoring. Like topside, we can look like everything is successful. We've got everything under control. And then underneath, maybe we're wrestling with anxiety, maybe addictions, other kinds of things like that.
Yeah.
Very often in our lives, things are not as they appear.
So it's in the lower decks really where our lives are formed. And this is where the Titanic and discipleship come together.
Yeah.
So discipleship involves being formed and made in something. And, you know, in the case of what we're going to be talking about today, it's made and formed in the image of Jesus.
Yeah.
You know, a disciple is a follower. It's someone who follows someone else's lead and example. Now, most of us don't take the time to go really deep because we've been discipled into superficiality.
Yeah.
we really pay attention to the things on the surface, but we ignore the things down deep. And that doesn't really cut it.
Yeah.
It's not good enough. It's not what God wants for us. It's not enough for us. Just going at the surface doesn't get us to all the complexity and the depth and the nuance of life that we need to be fully formed followers of Jesus.
In this series, we're inviting you to go underneath the surface, to really look below to what's going on in the lower decks. And as we're leading up to Easter, we're looking forward to celebrating the resurrection of Jesus, and we want to be deeply formed by Jesus.
So Jesus wants to form his life in us, not just on the surface, but through all the parts of our lives. And this is really the difference between discipleship, where it's just sort of an accessory that we have in our lives, and something that is powerful and deeply transformative.
Yeah.
And I want that for myself. I want that for you. I want that for everyone who's worshiping with us. Like, not just faith as an accessory, but something that really makes a difference in our lives. And that's not going to happen when we just sort of trot out our faith whenever we feel like it. Or if we sort of have a faith where Jesus is just kind of, oh, he's there, but only occasionally pay attention to him. It's only going to come if we really give ourselves to this and allow ourselves to be deeply formed. So when we follow Jesus, it's super easy to fall into this false dichotomy where we kind of work on the outer transformation and miss the inner transformation. And that's not what God wants for us. God wants all of us.
Yeah, you're so right. So one of the things we do here is we have chat questions, and we just stop and process and talk about it. And we're going to start with a chat question about boats.
Which freaked me out, I gotta be honest. I'm not a boat person.
So, I mean, the question is just that. What's your relationship with boats? Do you love them? Do you hate them? Somewhere in between. Take a moment and talk about it. So as we already mentioned, we're going to be relying heavily on Rich Villodas' book, The Deeply Formed Life. He also has some sermons that we're pulling from, and we're just inspired by the work that he's done in this book.
It's great stuff.
He writes about how it's so easy to fall into this trap of paying attention to what's on the surface instead of looking underneath. And he tells us about how, like, it's so important to look at this inward transformation, because in so many places, the surface level transformation, like, it's kind of been misused, and like people have used that to manipulate people. So he writes this, he says, in some conservative traditions, transformation is about getting the right theology in one's head while overlooking the inner work God wants to do in us.
So he knows that about conservatives. Progressives also suffer from this. And he says, in some progressive traditions, transformation is about right action and engagement within the world, but often at the expense of personal humility and mercy.
And then he doesn't stop there. He keeps going. He says, finally, well, in some charismatic and Pentecostal traditions, transformation is about getting the right experience, but without the deeper work of loving well and exploring our inner worlds.
Yeah, we're all being formed by something. And for most of us, our risk is being shallowly formed, or formed in the wrong ways, like not fully formed.
So, like, we're formed by our families of origin. We're formed by the sort of carefully curated platforms on social media. We're formed by a value system of the world that determines worth based on accomplishments, possessions, efficiency, intellectual achievement, and skills. To be deeply formed is to be regularly called back to the essence of our lives in God. Put simply, this is Christ formed in us.
It's a beautiful thing when it happens.
It is.
It is. From a young age, I think about this idea of formation, and from a young age, I've been thrust into leadership roles. I can think back to high school when I got a job working for a landscaping company. Pretty quickly, I started leading crews of men, like grown men, on landscaping jobs and going out and having a leadership role. I think throughout college, I was a youth group leader for the middle school youth group at our church. And then that's continued since then. When I arrived at Sycamore Creek, I pretty quickly got into leading small groups. And then within a year, I was leading the whole small groups ministry at our church. And those opportunities, they've been wonderful opportunities. I'm so grateful for the opportunities that I've had to do leadership things. At the same time, there's a danger, I think, in that. And the danger is that I'd live my life off the natural gifts I have and not do the deep work of character formation.
Yeah.
So my gifts, and this is true of your gifts, of all of our gifts, they'll only take us so far. What we really need is deep character. And the gifts and the opportunities we have to use are going to be limited by the amount that our character is formed and shaped. Being deeply formed leads to deep character.
So Paul was an early missionary, and he wrote lots of letters to the churches that he was discipling, that he was, teaching and influencing. And in one of Paul's letters, he wrote to a group of people who were kind of obsessed with like the surface level religious changes that they could do. And he challenged them to go deeper, to be deeply formed. He says, I am shocked that you are turning away so soon from God, who called you to himself through the loving mercy of Christ. You're following a different way that pretends to be the good news, but it is not the good news at all. You're being formed by those who deliberately twist the truth concerning Christ. So the Galatians, they had drifted from the simple message, of God's grace and the transformation that can come through Christ. And instead, they had started following a sort of cosmetic gospel, a shallow gospel, where following Jesus just wasn't enough. And so Paul's correcting that they were only focused on the outer stuff, and he wanted them to be focused on the inside stuff, an inside-out transformation. We're transformed. We're truly transformed by saying yes to Jesus again and again and again, to Christ's self-giving, poured out redemptive love. So we take it in and we receive it, and we're formed by us, every part of us, from the inside out.
And then a little bit later in Galatians, Paul says, "Oh, my dear children, I feel as if I'm going through labor pains for you again, and they will continue until Christ is fully developed in your lives." Paul had one focus, that Christ would be fully formed in us.
You know this about me. I grew up in North Carolina. I grew up in a family that was really involved in our small church. It was a pretty small church, and we were there like 2 or 3 times a week, like every week. We were just in each other's lives. And I was in Sunday school, and then in middle school, I was part of the Bible quizzing team, which was like, I've just memorized a bunch of verses and then answered questions. It was very nerdy, but it was awesome.
Sounds like it.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was me. I don't know. And then in high school, I went on a couple mission trips. So the first one I went on was to Malawi and Ethiopia, and the second one I went on was a backpacking trip across Europe. But that was sort of the time that I look back and say that was when I began to make my faith my own. Like I didn't just believe in things about God because my parents had told me. I started to make it my own, and that kind of continued. And it really has been the greater church community, like the small groups that I've been involved with, that have held me as I have processed grief and losses and encouraged me to navigate conflict with some level of like dedication. And then here at Sycamore Creek, like just being involved in small groups, like all of those things have been part of forming me in Christ.
My story is somewhat similar. I grew up in the Grand Rapids area here in Michigan, and I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. And as part of the church, we regularly attended worship. We went to worship in the morning and in the evening, 2 times on Sundays. I was a part of a Christian school, and in my Christian school, my teachers regularly shared their faith with me. And I grew up in the church and surrounded by people who love Jesus. And eventually that led me to high school and to being involved in our church's youth group. And I remember as I got into that youth group, like I love to do church things. So I sang the songs, I memorized the Bible verses. I love to do the right thing. Like it felt really good to me if I knew the rules and I followed the rules exactly. Those were all really good things. So when I was in youth group, we went on a youth retreat to Rhode Island. It was a great big retreat with kids from all over the country. And while I was at that retreat, I made the significant decision that I wanted to give my life to Jesus. And when I came back to Grand Rapids, eventually was in front of my whole church, and I made a public profession of faith. Wow. And I didn't fully know what I was getting into. I didn't fully know what I was doing, but that commitment is something that was really important to me, and it's something that I've returned to a lot since then. At times when I felt like I've wandered from God, I've been able to return to that commitment that I made when I was in high school. And eventually that put me on the path where I came to Sycamore Creek, eventually as first just a person in the pews, and then eventually now as a pastor. Yeah. But I'm so grateful for Sycamore Creek and the role it's played in forming me and forming my faith. A big part of that has been small groups and being a part of small groups. And I think about the small groups and ways I've experienced God, and it's really led me to a deeper understanding of my own brokenness in the areas where I need healing. It's helped me understand my areas of pride and where I need humbling. It's helped me to better live out my faith and to be more active in loving others, speaking up and doing things where I see injustice, and recognizing that a deeply formed life is formed by a real broad variety of experiences.
At our best, Christ will be formed in us through a wide variety of sources. To be deeply formed also involves being widely informed. Faithful Christian witness means holding on to the beautiful and diverse ways that God acts among God's people. One of the ways that I like to think about this is through tree roots, and specifically like the redwood forest. And
it's almost like we're here right now.
I know.
No, maybe
Except,
not.
Probably not.
Not quite as big.
I have never been to see the redwoods, but
I haven't either.
This summer, we're planning to go visit my sister. She lives in Oregon. It's like, okay, we'll be on the West Coast. Let's try to go down to California and see them. Hopefully that happens. But these trees, they're amazing. They tower amazing. Like 200 feet tall. Some of them grow even like 400 feet tall, which...
That is so tall.
Is like hard to wrap my head around. And to put that into perspective, the tallest building in Lansing is the Bogie Tower. And that's like 364 feet tall.
Wow.
So these trees are like taller than that building. And what's amazing about them is that they grow that tall because of their root system, but their roots only go like 5 or 6 feet deep. They stretch out like hundreds of feet, and they're like interconnected. I mean, it's just like wild when I really wrap my head around the marvel of these trees.
Those trees and their roots are such a powerful metaphor of Christian discipleship and our faith formation in Christ. God wants us to be fully alive. God wants us to live a full life like a really tall, big redwood tree. But in order to do that, we're going to need a root system that's powerful enough to hold us together. Yeah. And I think that's the thing about the redwoods is it's not just an individual tree either. Like they grow together and their roots are interconnected. We're going to need a complex root system with lots of layers and depth of spiritual formation. We're going to need integration. We're going to need intersection. We're going to need intertwining. We're going to need interweaving to be fully formed.
Yeah, to develop this complex root system, we'll be talking in this series about 5 values that we need to be deeply formed. As Rich Velotis talks about, we need a sort of multi-layered approach of Christian identity and mission. And that approach involves 5 values. So let's just talk through them real quick to let people know what's coming.
Yeah. So the first value is contemplative rhythms for an exhausted life. And this is basically that we each need time with God. We were created to be rooted in a way of life that's slow, vibrant, and transformative. That makes a difference in our lives. And that's pretty different than the way most of us live our lives. Most of us don't have contemplative rhythms. So we'll explore that next week.
Yeah. And then the next week after that, we'll talk about racial reconciliation for a divided world. So the church is at its best when it's a prophetic community that practices wholeness and unity in a deeply partisan and ideologically segregated landscape. prophets point us to God and where God wants us to be, where God would have us to go. And we need to be a people of wholeness and unity where we can come together in God despite our differences.
So the third value is interior examination for a world living on the surface. So most of us don't have great tools to, examine and to look at our interior world. And that can be a problem because it can cripple us with anxiety. It can cause us to miss opportunities to grow into the mature people that God would have us be, who love others well.
Yeah. And the fourth value that develops our root system for a deeply formed life is sexual wholeness for a culture that splits bodies from soul. So most of us don't fully integrate our spiritual world with our bodies. And a deeply formed life involves letting God love our whole selves and transform our whole selves, seeing our bodies as gifts to steward for the flourishing of our lives and for our relationships. And for this message, we're going to have Bishop Bard, the bishop for the Michigan Conference, and he's going to be giving our message that day.
He will. And that will bring us up to our fifth and final value. That value will take us up to the weekend before Easter. And that value is missional presence for a distracted and disengaged people. We'll learn how to make space in our lives for other people that allows that to be meaningful and impactful. We'll be challenged to move out into the world together, to be on mission together wherever we might be, to be a presence of healing and of hope for people around us.
Yeah. So we've given a roadmap for where we're going over the next 5 weeks as we look at these 5 values. And as we reflect on that, let's have one more discussion question.
Sounds good.
Which of the deeply formed life values most intrigue you and why? So throughout the rest of this series, we're going to be looking at these 5 values and talking about them and practicing them as we lead up to Easter and celebrate the resurrection of Jesus on Easter. For each of these 5 values, there's a theological and biblical vision component to the value, and there are practices that position us to be deeply formed. So we're going to look closely at why these values are important. But we're not going to stop there. We're also going to give all of us, myself and you and everybody, a chance to practice those things and really reflect on them and integrate them into our lives.
Yeah, I love the practical nature of exploring these practices that will help us to be deeply formed in Jesus. And at the same time, there's always a danger, though, right? When we approach things that we should do or that we need to do. It's really easy to be poorly formed through these practices and to have the practice become the end in and of itself. And that's not what we're shooting for. So let's give a few quick disclaimers on these practices.
Yeah. So the first one is practices don't save us or make God love us more.
They don't.
They just don't. They're not about earning God's love. They're about letting God's love penetrate deeply into our lives. And John Wesley was the founder of the Methodist Renewal Movement. And he talked about how these practices are like a means of grace. So they're not the grace of themselves. They're not the thing that make God love you, but they're sort of a vehicle by which we experience God's grace and love.
Practices do help us to receive and to express God's love to really in deeply formed ways. Basically, what we need is we need some actions. We need some things to do that help us to take in and then share God's love with others.
And practices have personal and communal elements to them. It's not like an either or, personal or communal. It's both and.
Yeah, so you can practice on your own and you can practice with your community. Our faith forming, it really happens, it's strengthened when there's things that we do, but then we get them reinforced and supported and encouraged by the people around us.
And every practice is strengthened, like the roots of other trees, by the presence of others on the journey with us.
And hopefully the practices that we'll explore throughout this series enliven or help other core practices, things that we're already doing. Remember, we're going deep in these practices. We're going deep in our spiritual formation. And we're really hoping to strengthen our roots down deep into Jesus. Now, some of the core practices we might already have, like Sunday worship, or prayer, or being a part of a small group, or giving regularly, or serving others, or fighting injustice. Those are all good things. Keep doing them.
Yeah.
But we do hope that we'll build on that throughout this series and be able to go even deeper in some of the things that we're already doing.
Practices aren't just about what we do. They're also a way of reframing how we think and what we see. The fun thing about these practices is that when they're done with self-awareness and reflection, the outer action produces inward transformation. We need some new ways of thinking, some new ways of seeing the world that's around us.
We do. And that brings us to practices take time.
Yeah.
And I'm talking to myself here because I need to hear this, a reminder to be patient. A redwood tree that's 200 feet tall, it doesn't just appear. It takes a lot of time for it to grow and develop. And the same thing is true in our lives being deeply formed in Christ. It's going to take time. It's going to take practice. And so we need to be patient with these practices. As we work through different things in this series, try them, and they might not work right away.
Yeah.
They might not make a difference right away. But in the same way that it takes a small seed a long time to grow a big tree, it might take a little time for these practices to grow and develop in our lives to make a big difference, to allow the transformation that we want.
So today we're inviting everyone to be on a journey with us into being deeply shaped, transformed by God's gracious love for us.
Yes, and that idea of a journey, well, that brings us back to the Titanic again.
Yes. We do hope for a more successful journey than the Titanic's.
Absolutely. I hope so too. So we started with Titanic as a metaphor really for our lives, and how very often in our lives there's this sort of upper decks, the surface of our lives where everything can be looking great. But then the lower deck of our lives can be a totally different story. They can be a total mess. And most of us don't take the effort to go down below the lower decks of our lives. And again, as we've talked about throughout this whole series, that's what we want. The superficiality, living just on the upper decks, it doesn't cut it. God wants us to have a faith in Jesus that's deep, that's nuanced, that's complex, and that involves all of us being engaged and formed by Christ.
Yeah. So today we're inviting everyone to go below to the lower decks during the series and be deeply discipled by Jesus. And I think one way we could do that even this week is maybe just to spend some time journaling and reflecting. Like you could pull out a sheet of paper and write upper decks and lower decks and just describe them. In your life, what do the upper decks look like? In your life, what do the lower decks look like? Are they the same? Is there a stark contrast there? And what is that about? Just take some time to reflect and process that. We're going to be preparing together for our celebration at Easter in April. So let's seek together to look deeper and be deeply formed by Jesus. I think as we do that, we'll head together toward one of the best Easters that we might ever have, because we'll have an increased understanding of the depth of God's love for us and how we respond to and live out that love.